Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Good morning. This week, war will be much in the news as President Obama arrives to discuss the bloody conflict in Afghanistan and Libya with David Cameron. And war is our theme as well. David Price-Jones has written a study of those who over the centuries have left Britain to go and fight for foreign causes. Idealists or traitors, he asks. Angie Hobbs is a philosopher studying what it means to be a hero from ancient times to now. The Guardian's Richard Norton-Taylor has turned transcripts of the inquiry into the death of the Iraqi civilian Baha Musa at the hands of British troops into a play. And we're going to start with Sherard Cowper-Coles, formerly our man in Kabul, who has written a gripping memoir of his time in Afghanistan, strongly critical of the conduct of that conflict and relations in particular between politicians and soldiers. Sherard, can I just start by taking you back to the moment when you were in Saudi Arabia and you got the call to go to Afghanistan? What you hoped and feared for that time?
Well, Andrew, I thought, like many people, that it was the good war. I'd been very doubtful about the wisdom of invading Iraq. There was a romantic feeling about going up the Hindu Kush into the great valleys of Afghanistan. And there was a feeling that being our ambassador in Kabul at that time when we were ramping up the military campaign was going to be a real job.
And you arrived to find clearly a shattered city, a rather sort of scattered and provisional kind of British diplomatic compound where you were then going to be living on porridge for a few years to come. And the key relationships were going to be not only with Karzai, about whom we'll speak in a moment, but also, of course, with the Americans.
Yes, with the American ambassador, Bill Wood, who is a highly intelligent man, a great lover of P.G. Wodehouse, but absolutely devoted to the war on drugs as well as the war on terror. He'd come from Colombia, and my first evening with him, he spent telling me how he wanted to spray the whole of the Helmand Valley from north to south with Roundup.
And he was called Chemical Bill, he was known as.
That was the nickname he'd already been given by the Kabul Diplomatic Corps.
And Karzai, you met early on, clearly quite a charming man in many ways, but a very, very difficult individual too.
Yes, I became increasingly fond of Karzai. He's a great king, but a very poor chief executive. He doesn't enjoy administration. He knows he doesn't enjoy administration. He's doing an almost impossible job. And many of his criticisms of what we were getting wrong, civilian casualties, the way we stirred up a hornet's nest in Helmand, as David Richards and others have admitted now we did, many of his criticisms were right. Right maybe for the wrong reasons, but he's a decent, weak man caught in an extraordinarily difficult position.
And caught in a capital where vast amounts of money have simply been stolen from the bank, we now find, and disappeared off to sort of posh houses in the Gulf.
Stolen from the bank, stolen from Western aid money, stolen from the drugs trade. I never found evidence that Karzai himself was corrupt, but there were plenty of people around him who were taking suitcases full of dollar bills out to Dubai or wherever.
And tracing the next few steps of this unhappy story, a lot of the analysis of your narrative concerns the relationship between the military, British military in our case obviously, but also the American military by extension, and the politicians at home. The military keep saying we need more of this, we need more of that, we need more boots on the ground, we need more helicopters, then we can finish the job. And one, I suppose, of the great mysteries of all of this is why politicians are not challenging and asking more. Well, what is the job that we are finishing? What is the nature of the task?
Yeah, well, you've put your finger on the heart of it. And I went out to Afghanistan as a huge enthusiast of the military, and I still am. I've nothing but praise for the courage and professionalism of the soldiers on the ground. But the generals back in Whitehall are natural enthusiasts, are naturally keen to defend their institutions. And up until the British general election last year, we had a Labour Prime Minister who was terrified of criticism from the Tory press, from the opposition, of not backing our boys. So instead of following his instincts, which were that simply pouring more troops in without a political strategy was not going to do any lasting good. It does do temporary local good, but it's not sustainable after we leave. Gordon Brown was pushed time and again by an over-enthusiastic military into sending more troops, and the same happened on a much larger scale with President Obama. And what is so heartening is in your interview yesterday, Andrew, and David Cameron, I know, believes this as well, we've at last got the politicians pushing back and saying, hang on a moment, military force is a means, not an end. It's a subset of a wider political strategy. And for too long we've believed that pouring troops in, which is actually applying anaesthetic to locally and temporarily to a patient who's suffering from cancer. And we haven't been dealing with curing the causes of the disease, which run much deeper and wider than simply the problem of the Taliban and a Pashtun insurgency in certain areas of the country. And Obama now is coming out, has got the political courage to come out and say that. David Cameron has known that from the beginning. We had a seminar at Chequers last year, but he can't do anything without the Americans. But the military are naturally enthusiastic. They wouldn't be good soldiers if they weren't. But sometimes they need a confident politician to say, hang on, the can-do approach isn't enough.
I suppose the great dilemma is that the fear that if once the pullout begins, and it's clearly going to start this summer, and we don't know how long and how quickly it's going to go on for, that the Taliban simply sweep back like the sea, and we are right back with all the hideous consequences of Taliban-ruled Kabul, and all of it will go down as completely wasted blood and treasure.
Yeah, well, again, Andrew, you've put your finger on the heart of the question. And by leaving it so late, giving ourselves 3 years to pursue a political solution, we're running a huge risk. I mean, Britain in Northern Ireland, my son wrote a thesis on this. Britain in Northern Ireland started talking to the IRA in 1972, started pursuing a political solution. It's only in the last few months that the CIA has been authorized to open proper, serious channels to the Taliban. And building a political process which involves not just the Taliban, but all the internal parties, all the regional parties. It's a double-decker bus with the regional players, Pakistan, India, China, Russia, the great game round 3, if you like, them on the top deck.
So do you think we might end up with a quasi-partitioned Afghanistan with Taliban-ruled areas, Northern Alliance-ruled areas, Kabul separate, and large Western bases there in case al-Qaeda return?
I hope very much not. I mean, what we need is a serious, far-reaching political settlement, and that means leadership from the top. It means the American president, it means the American Secretary of State leading this process.
Richard Norton-Taylor.
We'll come back to the generals. It's clear that although as the generals were the politicians deferred to the generals were also, I think, frightened that if they didn't go, they didn't say, we can do X, Y, and Z, we can do anything you like. Tony Blair, which was in the middle of in 2006, I think, to go into Afghanistan, Blair would turn around and say, well, you can't have a budget then. What's the point of having an army if you can't do what we want you to do, Tony Blair in particular? And I think also the army then and the defence chiefs in general were concerned because they came out of southern Iraq with their sort of tail between their legs and they wanted to sort of prove themselves in Afghanistan.
And you can see, can't you, Sherard, that if you're a politician, if you're a minister, you have fervently patriotic pro-army press at home. If a general says, I need this or I need that, my boys need this, my boys need that, the politician who says no, well, you can't have it's a brave fellow.
Yes, he is. And of course, what's nice when you become a politician is you have the generals coming to you saying, yes, we can do it, sir, of course, sir, but just we need another 150 armoured vehicles and another battalion or two. And you have the civil servants and the diplomats and the intelligence analysts saying, on the one hand, sir, on the other hand, minister, this is all very difficult, minister. So, you know, the temptation to go with the military against your better political instincts is overwhelming, but you repent at leisure for mistakes made like that.
David Price-Jones.
There's always an argument for talking to your enemy, but it's a slippery slope, because once you start, you make concessions, you make appeasement, you lead towards surrender, and it may not work. Look at Hezbollah, look at Hamas, look at the IRA. You empower these people by giving them more importance than they deserve. And I understand that the political process, I'm sure you're right, is necessary, but it contains very great dangers too.
Well, I could hardly disagree more, David. I'm afraid insurgencies are never ended by military force. I mean, I was ambassador in Israel, and one of the great tragedies in Israel was that in the 1930s, Britain suppressed by force the Arab uprising, as you know, from 1936 to 1939, using absolutely brutal methods. A young British officer called Bernard Montgomery was part of the hugely increased British forces in Palestine then. And then after the war, the Jewish insurgency started, and the general officer commanding in Palestine, the High Commissioner, sent a cable to London, to the War Office and Colonial Office, saying we need to negotiate with the moderate Jewish insurgents, with the Zionists. We need a sensible political solution. And General Montgomery, who was by then Chief of the Imperial General Staff, wrote on that cable, "This is appeasement. We don't talk to terrorists. We're going to crush the Jewish insurgency by force as we crushed the Arab insurgency." By the end in Palestine, Britain had 100,000 men, a Guards Brigade, 20,000 paramilitary police, the 6th Airborne Division fresh from Arnhem, and we lost. We left Palestine with our tail between our legs, and as we saw with Obama's speech this week, we are still living with the consequences of that fateful decision not to negotiate.
Malaysia is a different story, and I think a lot of people are unhappy that the IRA have been empowered in Northern Ireland. And of course you're absolutely right that military means alone are not sufficient. But once you start negotiating with people who wish you ill, you're in trouble.
Angie Hobbs, philosophical perspective, please.
Yes, it's a similar question. I mean, I completely agree that talking to the Taliban is crucial, and I noted that Obama was endorsing that policy with some qualifications over the weekend. I just wonder if, and I don't think that talking to people who are potentially hostile to you means that you're in any way condoning or endorsing what they're doing. I just wonder, do you think there are any examples of acts which are so extreme that you kind of think, in this particular instance, talking's no good? For instance, coming across extermination or concentration camps in the Second World War.
Or 9/11, potentially.
Are there ever
Can't talk to
instances
Al-Qaeda.
where you think, in this case, for once, as a rare exception, dialogue is useless, they just have to go? I'm just interested.
No,
I'm interested.
I
don't know.
I completely agree. I mean, you need to combine the gun with the olive branch. And the tragedy in Afghanistan is that for years we've been using the gun without a serious olive branch. Special forces have been going out killing the Taliban, but we haven't been harvesting that politically.
Just before we move on, Sherard, do you think, looking back, this is a war that should not have been fought?
No, I think we had to go into Afghanistan, but I think trying to...
Could we not have held off and got Al-Qaeda expelled?
Well, as I say in the book, we could have done, but I think realistically the pressure on the United States president for violent revenge, the pressure from the American people to do something violent and immediate after the appalling atrocity of 9/11 was overwhelming. And if we could have waited for the Taliban to spit out the Arabs who had betrayed their hospitality, the Arab terrorists, but I don't think that was realistic. The big mistake was mission creep, moving from dealing with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to, as Richard Holbrooke says, fighting the wrong enemy in the wrong country, and then trying to rebuild Afghanistan as a modern democracy with a constitution that specifies 14 national elections in the next 20 years.
We're outside their political process, and we don't know, and we shall never be able to find out what the true relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban is. That's their business. We can't find that out, and it's always the case in dealing with these enemies. It's the same with Hezbollah and Hamas. We don't know their internal political process, and we're at a disadvantage.
David Price-Jones, we could talk about this for the rest of the programme very, very easily, but we're going to move on to your book, Treason of the Heart, from Thomas Paine to Kim Philby. And this is a book about people, idealists or extremists of left, right, all sorts of different views, who leave these shores and go off and fight foreign wars. And it includes people who are sort of icons to the left, Thomas Paine being an obvious example, who was involved in the American Revolution and then the French Revolution, through to modern traitors and people from the right, all the people who went off to fight for black shirts and indeed ended up fighting for Hitler, some of them. What unites such a disparate group of people, in your view?
Well, I think there were several common factors. The one that surprised me most, I think, was the hatred that they felt for their own country. It's a common theme for pretty much all the people that I'm writing about. I mean, Tom Paine loathed England and everything to do with it, and it goes right the way through. People like Byron expressed their hatred of England, and of course, when you come to those who support Hitler and Stalin, they are really preferring monsters to the quiet life of, shall we say, E.M. Forster at home. That's one thing. I think the other thing is self-righteousness. They all of them believe that they are absolutely in possession of the truth and must make everybody else aware of that truth. And I think the last part of the thing is the condescension, that because they came from Britain, and Britain was a very secure and relatively constitutional country, they felt it was quite free to make other people fall in with their opinions. So the patronisation tone of it all is simply extraordinary.
Do you not think, you could see it from the other side and say that these are people with a vision of a better world of some kind, and they go abroad because they think it's open to be created there, that there is America, here is a potential new kind of society that can be built, or whether it's going to be even down to the deluded people who went to Russia, dreaming that this was going to be the new civilization. The Webbs, famously, with their book Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, they called it. There is a note of trying to remake the world. And at least they didn't try and remake it here.
Well, that is, of course, Tom Paine's view. Tom Paine was right in the sense that America should have been independent, and all the beaux esprits of the time thought that too. But he was right for the wrong reason. I mean, he was right in the idealism, but wrong in his motivation, which was to hurt England. At the end of it all, really, there's corpses. And the thing that really, I suppose, emerges from my book is that idealism is intimately connected with killing other people. That's what they felt that they wanted was the right course of action. And when you take up all sorts of minor nationalisms, which is one of the subjects of my book, taking up the Armenian cause or the Italian cause or whatever,
the Greek cause with Byron's case,
yes, the Greek cause, or the Spanish Civil War. The idealism is overcast by the fact that a lot of people are going to get killed.
And what about the counter-argument that it may be a dreadful thing that they all went away and killed people abroad, but what would this country have been like if they had pursued their visions at home?
Well, I think it was it was impossible. I think that public opinion wouldn't have followed with them. That is again one of the rather curious things, is to see the standard procedure. That what happens is there are a small number of very strong-minded people, and they set up a committee and they get an MP or two, and then they get their hold on public opinion that way.
Everybody wants to jump in. Angie Hobbs, first of all.
Yes, David, I'm interested in how you define treason, because, of course, within a particular nation-state, it's usually defined by the people who run that state. So you're going to get a lot of different legal conceptions of what counts as treason. And if the people running that state are a vile dictatorship, then somebody working for the common good could be denounced as a traitor. So treason is a very tricky term. I'm wondering how you think of it.
Well, I call my book Treason of the Heart, and the heart is not the whole person. Of course, there is different kinds of treason, and I was really interested in ideology. What makes these people go abroad to looking for foreign causes to fight for? Does that help you?
So a kind of sanctity of the nation-state, is that underpinning your argument here?
No, I suppose it's
this nation-state.
That's right, this nation-state.
Okay.
Not all of them.
It's treason of ideology, but also of religion. Kim Philby's father, for example, became a convert to Islam, which is interesting. In Kim Philby's only rather self-serving book, My Silent War, the preface was by Graham Greene, a Catholic, who likened Philby's enthusiasm, or later enthusiasm, for communism as a religion, rather like if you're in Elizabethan England, you are divided loyalties. You're Catholic, you are your loyalties of the Catholic Church, Philip II of Spain, not any part of the British state. George Blake's background was interesting. His mother was a Calvinist Dutch woman. His father was a Turkish Jewish merchant who lived in Egypt. I think the intelligence service thought this was a wonderful guy because he spoke a lot of languages and so on. But where were his loyalties? He actually asked himself that.
Of course, there is what I'm talking about really is a transfer of allegiance, aren't I? I mean, normally speaking, you have some allegiance to the place where you're born, the language that you grew up in, sometimes the religion that you grew up with, the people around you, the landscape. These give you an identity. So that's what we're talking about. And all the characters of my book are making transfers of allegiance to another identity. And it's the transfer of allegiance and the motivation and how they actually did it that is very interesting to see. Philby, as a matter of whom we raised, I mean, he explained it purely in terms of power. Do you remember in that same book that you referred to? He says that when made an offer by the KGB, it was an offer from a power that he couldn't refuse. And
I'm not saying I sympathise with Graham Greene. Graham Greene was very naive in saying that comparing communism with Catholicism. Yeah.
Well, Graham Greene was a mischief maker, wasn't he?
Sherard.
Well, perhaps I could borrow a quotation which I'm sure Angie is familiar with from the Delphic Oracle, nothing in excess, Maden Agon. Yeah. David, I find your approach rather sort of gloomy and one-sided because I think there is a place for idealism and there are people who go to fight abroad for very laudable motives. I mean, I think of the Polish exile community here who went to support a free Poland, not necessarily fighting. But I think above all of a group you don't really mention in your book, which is British Jewry, who went to Palestine to fight for a free Palestine. There were bodies, there was idealism. And, I mean, you don't mention them, but I would be the last to condemn those people for going out and fighting for a Jewish state. I mean, I think we should have negotiated a solution, but we didn't. And if I were a British Jew, I would have understood that. But you seem to be condemning them, or have I got you wrong?
I didn't touch on that because it seemed a special case. And I was trying to be more general, really. Of course I wouldn't condemn such people. But their motivation was pretty clear. I mean, they were actually not transferring allegiance, but spreading an allegiance that they had grown up with.
How often do you think that people who turned violently against this country did so because of an early experience in their childhood or adolescence?
Well, that's what William Cobbett says was motivating Tom Paine, that something happened in the childhood of Tom Paine that turned him against England. I think the same is probably true about Byron, and I think it's probably true about Lawrence of Arabia, who did immense harm to Great Britain.
And he was a very strange character.
Yes, a very strange character.
Without going into the details. Right. You mentioned Byron there, who would be, I suppose, an archetypal hero, a Byronic hero. We still talk about that term. Angie Hobbs, you're writing a book about heroes and heroism. You're a philosopher, but particularly interested in ancient or classical philosophy. And so you start with the classical notion of hero, which has a very specific meaning.
Yes, it often has an almost semi-technical sense, a heros of somebody who has one divine parent and one mortal parent, such as Achilles. And I'm sure there were many ancient Greeks who did take that religious view seriously, and even for the more secular-minded amongst them, it conveyed the notion of somebody who was exceptional, who did something which was at least perceived to be of outstanding benefit to their community or a subgroup in their community which other people just couldn't do. And that notion of the exceptionality with both the benefits and the potential for harm, that continues. And what's so interesting is that though, of course, the content of the notion of the hero changes throughout the ages and throughout the cultures, and as I'm sure we'll go on to discuss, one can find out an awful lot about a community or culture, and indeed one's potential enemy by finding out who their heroes are. every culture needs heroes for a very wide variety of psychological and economic reasons. And where we are now, of course, is that though to some extent the word hero is sort of traduced in the media to a large extent and has become cheapened and has become confused with celebrity in many cases, the term heroism in my research is that has not been so cheapened. We seem to want to retain some kind of notion of purity in the notion of heroism, even if for all sorts of economic and political and military reasons we bandy the term hero around.
Because in the ancient world, there was no sense that a hero had to be a generally admirable, morally upright, attractive figure. I mean, I'm thinking of Achilles and his dreadful, petulant sulk, as recorded by Homer, or the behaviour of many, I guess, Roman heroes who are extreme. They may be corrupt, they may be promiscuous, they may be exceedingly violent, even cruel, but they can still be heroes because they achieve that special thing that nobody else can do. Yes,
I mean, heroism is not the same as courage. It will often involve the virtue of courage. There's, of course, a big philosophical debate about whether the courage have subjective or objective criteria. But for a hero, I would argue the criteria are subjective. Does an individual, a community, a nation, whoever the hero belongs to, do they perceive this person to be performing acts of great benefit to them? Subjective criteria.
At what point does the notion of fighting and heroism become taken apart? I'm thinking, for instance, not far from here there's a statue of Edith Cavell, the nurse who was shot at dawn for helping prisoners escape, never fought and said famously that patriotism is not enough, but was a hero. When does that start?
OK, well, I'll be contentious here. I would very specifically say it begins with Plato. I know I might say that. He is one of my heroes. He argues throughout his dialogues that a character like Socrates, who, though he fought admirably on military campaign, is primarily, of course, noted for his mental strength in upholding the values of philosophy in the face of Athenian attack and a death sentence. So Plato will portray Socrates as a hero. Plato's always saying there are other kinds of model. You can be a hero in peacetime. It doesn't have to be on the battlefield. There are various ways in which you can benefit your community through being a philosopher, a scientist. I was going to say an artist, but of course Plato has ambivalent views about artists. So you start to get these notions untangled. And of course, we get a lot of tensions throughout history between the notion of the military hero, the social justice reformer, and so on.
So your hero is a sort of profound anti-democrat who wants to support tyrants and who admires Socrates, who is, of course, very, very hostile to the Athenian democratic polis and is remembered as a hero because of his death.
The whole point is that's the whole point. You don't have to admire every feature of your hero to regard them as a hero. I don't admire every view of Winston Churchill, but I still think he
for
can count
those
as a hero.
days in 1940.
Exactly, they don't have to be entirely virtuous people by any means.
The modern hero. You said yourself that this has been a degraded term. Would you say, for instance, that the fact that every British soldier is routinely described as a hero in the press is an example of that?
Well, this is interesting. When there's the next military or political blunder, if that should ever happen, just check how quickly some military commander or politician calls the people who have fallen through their own mistakes a hero. Now, sometimes these soldiers may well be heroes. At other times, they just got unlucky and were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's a very good ruse to divert attention. And also, less cynically, it's a way of reassuring the families their loved ones didn't die in vain.
Richard Norton.
Also, other people's mistake. Help for heroes, which the tabloid press go on for. Every single soldier who's in Afghanistan is a hero. I don't think they would like to be called a hero, particularly. That kind of label, rather self-conscious label. They are very, very brave, but that is different from being a, quote, hero, unquote. isn't it?
I agree. I mean, there's a difference, I think, between courage and heroism. I mean, for me, the notion of heroism has a notion of going beyond duty about it. I mean, the technical term would be supererogation, and you're not just doing what your job requires you to do. You're going beyond that. Now, of course, there's a debate about who says what your duty is and whose perception is involved here. And very often, we will see people interviewed on television who we think have committed the most heroic acts, but they will often modestly and genuinely describe themselves as just doing their duty. When Nelson, and then it can go the other way. When Nelson sort of said, England expects that every man will do his duty. He's actually calling on his men to perform some pretty heroic actions, but he redescribes them as duty because it's a way to get them on board and to make them feel this is doable, they can achieve this. So it can be manipulated both ways.
David Price-Jones.
If the figure of Achilles is going to be a hero, doesn't Homer present him as somebody who does something really dreadful in killing Hector, and that your sympathy goes towards Hector, whose corpse is being dragged behind the chariot, and our hero is a show-off and a cruel man, and he may be benefiting society, as you say, but there are bad aspects of that.
Oh, of course. Well, I mean, Homer, or if there is one, Homer is a very great artist. The writer who collects all the stories that form the Iliad is a very great artist. So you get the rich complexity of Achilles. Yes, some of his actions they're criticised by other characters in the Iliad themselves. These are terrible massacres. The Trojan youths, for instance. He goes on a sort of blood rampage, and that's not softened down. But at the same time, he's the only character who questions the whole notion of war. What am I here? Why am I here making widows and orphans? So you get that subtlety. And yes, Hector's portrayed as a hero as well, and in the end, that's where your sympathies lie. But that's the genius of Homer. He's saying all these people are regarded as heroes in different ways for different reasons, and they're all complicated.
Well, let's turn now to other soldiers and a distinctly unheroic episode, Richard Norton Taylor, which I think a lot of people will remember from their television news screens at the time, where a man called Baha Musa, who was in a hotel, I think the hotelier, was arrested with others, some of them rather elderly men, by the British Army in Basra in 2003, and Baha Musa died in detention. And you have taken the transcripts of the inquiry into his death, and you have created a stage play called Tactical Questioning, scenes from the Baha Musa inquiry. Can we start, Richard, by sort of describing the conditions in which these soldiers were operating at the time and what had happened just before the arrest of these people?
Well, as their commanding officer, a guy called Mendonkra, and the soldiers' officers said and insisted and repeated time and time again, it was very hot in Basra at the time. It was 50-plus degrees and so on. Now, the real point is that they were ill-prepared for the invasion of Iraq, as we know from the Chilcot inquiry and other things. Now, this particular regiment, I think, described by the head of the army at the time, General Sir Mike Jackson, as a stain on the British Army as a whole. This particular regiment, the 1st Battalion, the Queen's Lancashire Regiment, was had a reputation of being quite a thuggish lot, and they were certainly pretty ill-disciplined by the evidence. Anyway, they picked up these...
There'd been some particularly traumatic killings
just before that. There'd been the killing of an officer in an ambulance by an insurgent in Basra, and then a number of Royal Military policemen had been killed. Now, their officers told the soldiers, looking for insurgents, looking for people who may know about these previous incidents, they hyped them up. The officers hyped up the soldiers. Now, that helps to explain. It doesn't condone, but it helps maybe to explain the attitude of the soldiers.
So these were pumped up, overheated in every way, yeah, and under-trained soldiers, and they were going out into Basra looking for insurgents. One of the people that they picked up was Baha Musa. Tell us about him.
Baha Musa, unfortunately, he was a hotel receptionist in Basra, and he and 9 others of his colleagues were arrested.
And they were taken into the compound.
They were
what
taken
happened to them?
into the Army's compound, or temporary detention centres, they called it, and they were held. Initially, they were hooded. They were hooded, subjected to noise, sleep deprivation, and so on. Techniques which, by the way, had been banned by Edward Heath way back in 1972.
After Northern Ireland.
After Northern Ireland and the European Court of Human Rights and so on. But they were hooded and they were beaten up, and videos show how they were, and some people call it Britain's Abu Ghraib, actually. They were abused tremendously, and they.
And some of these were quite elderly men, weren't they?
They were quite elderly men. Some of them were one was also a very young man, a sort of late teenager, who was taken out of the detention centre, put beside a hot generator, which was noisy and hot. Why? To make him more acceptable, or at least more open interrogation. They said an interrogation technique was to put this young fellow by a hot generator. They're all scared stiff. There was no evidence against them, and it was against all the discipline, the internal laws, if you like, and the rules of the British Army, as well as international law. But the chain of command did not even know what the laws said. And
describe Forrest's conditions in the room in which they were being held after a day or two.
Well, there were a number of in a very small detention centre. It was very hot. They were hooded. They were told to kneel with their hands behind their backs. Sometimes they were kneeling for hours on end. They were hooded. For hours and hours on end. And
so you took the transcripts of the inquiry because Abu Musa died in the course of this, and there was an inquiry into it by Musa, and you've taken the transcripts, which presumably very, very lengthy raw transcript, and turned it into something that people can go out to, if not for entertainment, as it were, but at least for education, I suppose, in a theatre.
Well, explanation, I think. The Tricycle Theatre under Nicholas Kent, we've done quite a few what we call tribunal plays, which take public inquiries, and I sort of edit them down. And Bloody Sunday was 10 years, I did it down to about 2 or 3 hours. You can do that, actually. I think the theatre is a tremendous platform or vehicle, talking as a journalist, an extension of journalism in a way.
Well, I was going to ask you this, because are you not doing very much what you've been doing as a journalist, looking for the kernel, the key turning points, and drawing them out?
But if you're running, if it's a running public inquiry, like a running court case, and maybe there's the odd sort of 500 word you do in an article for a newspaper, or maybe 2 minutes on a radio program, or half a minute on the television, you get a rather scattered, inconsistent, I think, appreciation of that. So what do? We have 2 hours and a bit. 90 minutes actually in the Baha Musa case. There are bums on seats. There are people who come and can. Without sounding too sort of arrogant about it, there's an explanation by definition. You can have 20,000 words rather than 250 words.
And what is the question that you are explaining?
You're explaining why the soldiers, in this case, behaved like they did, the context, if you like. The argument, which makes it easy for us, because they're all based on public inquiries where you get their defendant, a lawyer and a prosecuting lawyer, so they're actually put in on the spot, if you like. They put it in a corner, so they have to explain things, and they're
the ultimate confessional.
In a way. And they have to explain why they behaved like they did. And this is an extraordinary episode in a rather ill-prepared, serious military invasion.
Sherard Cowper-Coles.
Well, I read some of these transcripts, and it's just heartbreaking, and it's obviously heartbreaking for the Iraqis. Absolutely heartbreaking, but also for these young British soldiers who were completely out of their depth. And I wouldn't want to be too moralistic about this. I think this is what war does to people. The veneer of civilization is very thin, and for all the talk from generals and politicians about moral armies and about the rules of war, when you put young, testosterone-filled young people in that sort of situation, something cracks. It cracks in every army, the British Army, the American Army, the French in Algeria, the Israel Defense Force. We've seen it time and again. And there's a limit to how you can stop this. I mean, you have to bear down on it, but it's almost an inevitable consequence of war.
I agree. I think we could explain that why it was this. There are more incidents. Well, there are actually more incidents which we don't know about. Some we do know about, but we don't know about them publicly, as it were, because they haven't been properly investigated. And one of the reasons why, the MOD does cover itself in a very defensive attitude, which is not surprising. I suppose there are only one. This is rotten apples, but which doesn't.
You're saying it is you would agree it is the nature of conflict, it's the nature of war.
Yeah, it is in a way, and you can also you could actually say that it's surprising there weren't more incidents. Well, there were more, but not a lot more. And some people say it was systemic, but maybe it was systemic. The question is, there's one question though: could some of this be avoided by a preparation of the invasion of Iraq?
Angie.
Yes, I thought you were admirably sort of fair in giving all parties a sort of a voice. But you do say, quite rightly, that this has got to be good theatre as well, and that some of the editorial decisions have to take account of aesthetic reasons, such as varying the tone and varying the pace and so on. Did you ever find that there were tensions in that in between different editorial decisions, between fairness and objectivity on the one hand, and between a cracking good drama on the other?
In a way, of course, one tries to be as a journalist as fair as possible, but as a responsible journalist, but also because you want to get to use the theatre as a vehicle for giving information out. Rather, now Nick Kent, the director, would say, "No, let's have one or two other episodes which show more on the face of it, possibly trivial, I would say, but actually not trivial because they're very illuminating about people's characteristics. Episodes which themselves are not terribly substantial in terms of revealing knowledge, but important in revealing the characteristics of the people you're talking about."
David Price-Jones.
I don't think you need to restrict it to war, but it's just part of armies. Company sergeant majors and disciplinary corporals are not recruited in religious seminaries. And I served in the army myself, and as a junior officer I was absolutely unable to stop brutal violence in the guardroom. And there was nothing to be done about it, and the company sergeant major was just more powerful than me.
Richard.
Yeah, I think there's a culture there, isn't there? I mean, the British Army keep on saying, after incidents like Deep Cut, an incident where 4 young recruits were found dead, possibly suicide, probably suicide, but it's not clear yet. And these inquiries show that that there is this. Is it necessary? Do you have to have the regimental sergeant major? The British Army would say, yes, you have to have discipline, discipline, discipline. Then comes the question of the MOD. So we never bully, we never condone bullying, we fight bullying. Is there a conflict which can never be resolved there?
Well, we won't resolve it today because we've run out of time, but thank you very much indeed to all my guests. Richard Norton-Taylor's Tactical Questioning, Scenes from the Baha Musa Inquiry, is on at the Trischool Theatre in London from the beginning of June. David Price-Jones's Treason of the Heart, and Sherard Cowper-Coles' memoir of his time in Afghanistan, Cables from Kabul, are published this month. And you can hear Angie Hobbs at the Philosophy Festival, How the Light Gets In, which I think is a Leonard Cohen reference, at the Hay-on-Wye Festival this coming weekend. Next week, Paul Theroux, Salil Shetty and Charles Jenks, travelling the world and putting it to rights. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Asking more, well, what is the job that we are finishing? What is the nature of the task?
Yeah, well, you've put your finger on the heart of it. And I went out to Afghanistan as a huge enthusiast of the military, and I still am. I've nothing but praise for the courage and professionalism of the soldiers on the ground. But the generals back in Whitehall are natural enthusiasts, are naturally keen to defend their institutions. And up until the British general election last year, we had a Labour Prime Minister who was terrified of criticism from the Tory press, from the opposition, of not backing our boys. So instead of following his instincts, which were that simply pouring more troops in without a political strategy was not going to do any lasting good, it does do temporary local good, but it's not sustainable after we leave. Gordon Brown was pushed time and again by an over-enthusiastic military into sending more troops, and the same happened on a much larger scale with President Obama. And what is so heartening is in your interview yesterday, Andrew, but absolutely devoted to the war on drugs as well as the war on terror. He'd come from Colombia, and my first evening with him, he spent telling me how he wanted to spray the whole of the Helmand Valley from north to south with Roundup.
And he was called Chemical Bill, he was known as.
That was the nickname he'd already been given by the Kabul Diplomatic Corps.
And Karzai, you met early on, clearly quite a charming man in many ways, but a very, very difficult individual too.
Yes, I became increasingly fond of Karzai. He's a great king, but a very poor chief executive. He doesn't enjoy administration. He knows he doesn't enjoy administration. He's doing an almost impossible job. And many of his criticisms of what we were getting wrong, civilian casualties, the way we stirred up a hornet's nest in Helmand, as David Richards and others have admitted now we did, many of his criticisms were right. Right maybe for the wrong reasons, but he's a decent, weak man caught in an extraordinarily difficult
moment when you were in Saudi Arabia and you got the call to go to Afghanistan. What you hoped and feared for that time?
Well, Andrew, I thought, like many people, that it was the good war. I'd been very doubtful about the wisdom of invading Iraq. There was a romantic feeling about going up the Hindu Kush into the great valleys of Afghanistan. And there was a feeling that being our ambassador in Kabul at that time, when we were ramping up the military campaign, was going to be a real job.
And you arrived to find clearly a shattered city, a rather sort of scattered and provisional kind of British diplomatic compound where you were then going to be living on porridge for a few years to come. And the key relationships were going to be not only with Karzai, about whom we'll speak in a moment, but also, of course, with the Americans.
Yes, with the American ambassador, Bill Wood, who is a highly intelligent man, a great lover of P.G. Wodehouse. Difficult position.
And caught in a capital where vast amounts of money have simply been stolen from the bank, we now find, and disappeared off to sort of posh houses in the Gulf.
Stolen from the bank, stolen from Western aid money, stolen from the drugs trade. I never found evidence that Karzai himself was corrupt, but there were plenty of people around him who were taking suitcases full of dollar bills out to Dubai or wherever.
And tracing the next few steps of this unhappy story, a lot of the analysis of your narrative concerns the relationship between the military, British military in our case obviously, but also the American military by extension, and the politicians at home. The military keep saying we need more of this, we need more of that, we need more boots on the ground, we need more helicopters, then we can finish the job. And one, I suppose, of the great mysteries of all of this is why politicians are not challenging and ask. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Good morning. This week, war will be much in the news as President Obama arrives to discuss the bloody conflict in Afghanistan and Libya with David Cameron. And war is our theme as well. David Price-Jones has written a study of those who over the centuries have left Britain to go and fight for foreign causes. Idealists or traitors, he asks. Angie Hobbs is a philosopher studying what it means to be a hero from ancient times to now. The Guardian's Richard Norton-Taylor has turned transcripts of the inquiry into the death of the Iraqi civilian Baha Musa at the hands of British troops into a play. And we're going to start with Sherard Cowper-Coles, formerly our man in Kabul, who has written a gripping memoir of his time in Afghanistan, strongly critical of the conduct of that conflict and relations in particular between politicians and soldiers. Sherard, can I just start by taking you back to the